Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm Simona Rasik. I'm a committee member with San Diego and Imperial District Export Council, and I'm the Director of Global Trade at Getting to Global. Today, we will discuss the eDigital Trade Transaction Workspace. For short, I will often refer to it as DT Workspace, Digital Transaction Workspace. The DT Workspace is used for managing international trade transactions online using digital documents instead of paper. It follows the electronic rules for digital trade transactions as published on October 1st, 2021 by the International Chamber of Commerce under the Uniform Rules for Digital Trade Transactions, URDTT. Additionally, the workspace follows the electronic guidelines for documentary letter of credit as published by the ICC under Uniform Customs and Practice for Documentary Credits for Electronic Presentation, for short EUCP. The unique value of the DT workspace is that it does not only help you structure and manage international trade transactions, but it also supports buyers and sellers with the negotiation process. An important element of the workspace is the educational aspect of it. It teaches you how to negotiate a trade transaction, what information and documentation buyer and seller need from each other in order to close the trade negotiation, and how to select the Incoterm and the payment method. Next slide, please. The digital trade transaction workspace enables SMEs, buyers, and sellers to trade everywhere worldwide. The workspace objective is to increase international business by reducing the cost and complexity of trade using digital shared documents, a common business method, and International Chamber of Commerce e-rules and guidelines. The DT workspace is sponsored by the San Diego and Imperial District Export Council for the global trade community to go digital. The San Diego and Imperial District Export Council is a regional chapter of the National Association of District Export Councils, whose members are appointed by the US Secretary of Commerce. Next slide. A trade transaction occurs each time a buyer purchases goods or services from a seller in another country. A trade transaction is completed when a buyer purchases the transportation documents representing ownership or title of the goods from a seller. Globally, trade transactions occur millions of times a year, generating 4 billion paper documents that move around the world constantly, representing trillions of dollars of economic activity in about 200 countries. The trade transaction payment method is either collection or credit. The collection payment is paid by the seller directly to the buyer. The credit payment is paid by a third party, usually a commercial bank, with funds held in escrow for the seller. As we'll discuss later, the recent ICC rules, the Uniform Rules for Digital Trade Transactions, allow a non-bank financial institution to take the place of the confirming bank. Worldwide, collections are used in about 90% of global trade transactions. This payment method includes documents against payment, direct collection, and open account transactions. Credits are used in about 10% of global trade transactions, according to the last ICC survey. This payment method includes documentary letters of credit. Our workspace provides digital capability for both payment methods, so for 100% of the world trade transactions. Next slide, please. The ICC Uniform Rules for Digital Trade Transactions version 1.0 that was published on October 1st, 2021. Please note that moving forward, I'll be referring to these rules quite often as URDTT. So you'll be hearing me saying URDTT quite a lot. The URDTT rules enables digital trade transactions for SMEs, buyers, and sellers worldwide. The rules provide a framework that applies to each party or person that participates in a digital trade transactions. These rules are intended for a fully digital environment, to be neutral with regard to technology and messaging standards, and to extend into the corporate space and non-bank providers of financial services. The effect these rules are going to have on international trade cannot be overstated. These universal e-rules, together with video communication and interactive document technologies, enable millions of businesses all over the world to meet online, share documents, and trade at low cost with no bank fees, since banks are not involved in a URDTT transaction. Next slide. The ICC Uniform Customs and Practice for Documentary Credits for Electronic Presentation, EUCP version 2.0, was published on July 1st, 2019. The version 1.0 was published in April of 2002. The EUCP enables digital document presentation for UCP letter of credits in lieu of or in conjunction with paper original documents. These guidelines allow for digital documents to replace paper originals and copies when letter of credits are issued under SWIFT code 40E EUCP. These guidelines may be used by the seller to expedite the negotiation and payment of trade transaction by transmitting the export documentation electronically instead of by courier. Next slide. The Digital Trade Transaction Workspace, DT Workspace, is accessible under the link listed in the description of this video. The workspace follows the URDTT rules, the UCP and EUCP guidelines in its trade transaction digital document templates. The workspace is available to all SMEs worldwide at no cost and is used for digital trade transactions and for digital EUCP letters of credit. Next slide. The workspace implementation requires the buyer and seller to have computers and access to the internet. The eDigital Trade Transaction Workspace technology includes cloud technology. The workspace uses Google Chrome, Google Drive, Google Documents, and PDFs. Video technology, the video conference technology that's used is either Zoom or Google Meet or any other video communications. And webinar trainings. The workspace includes training webinars produced in Zoom like this one today and shared via YouTube. Next slide, please. Each digital document is a task required in all trade transactions. Trade transaction documents include, but are not limited to, the request for quotation, purchase order, notice of completeness, bill of lading, invoice, packing list, URDTT digital trade payment, release of funds and documents, payment obligation document, and others. Some of the trade management documents include some of the trade documents are the notice of completeness, the examination report, release of funds, release of documents. The objective of the workspace is to assure payment for the exchange of title of goods and services between a buyer and a seller. Assurance of payment is totally dependent on the parties to the transaction following proper digital transaction guidelines and rules. The URDT rules are for a completely digital environment, eliminating the need to print anything to paper unless required for ocean customs clearance or by the local law. Next slide, please. The workspace features 24+ digital trade transaction documents templates, and they're interactive between the buyer and the seller. Each digital document is interactive. They can be shared between the buyer and the seller on the video call and can be edited by the participants, locked or restricted to view only by the owner of each document. The digital documents conform to both the URDTT and the EUCP guidelines, and their use is explained in the Global Business Model Manual that is part of the Workspace. So when you access the Workspace at the link in the description of the video, you will find underneath the Workspace the Global Business Model Manual. The Workspace has several webinars explaining how to use the Workspace. The transaction documents contained a detailed transaction checklist and a detailed payment method checklist. We'll talk about this later. This is information required to define and structure both the trade transaction and the payment method. As mentioned before, access to the Workspace documents and training webinars is offered at no cost to all parties. Next slide, please. The DT Workspace uses the Global Business Model Manual as the management method for trade transaction. The Global Business Manual was published in 1999, has been used to manage transactions ever since, and has been updated recently to incorporate both the Uniform Rules for Digital Trade Transactions, URDTT, and the EUCP guidelines for letter of credit transactions. The Global Business Model provides a framework for trade transactions using the URDTT rules and the EUCP guidelines by providing the trade transaction structure prior to the shipping and prior to the creation of export documents. The Global Business Model is divided into the buying and the selling process. It can be used to manage either URDTT digital trade payment transaction using the URDTT e-rules, or to manage EUCP documentary letter of credit transaction using the EUCP guidelines. Next slide. The Global Business Model digital trade transaction document flow is quite traditional. The buyer and seller agree to trade with a basic order agreement for goods or services. The buyer requests a quotation and the seller provides a quotation. Once the terms and conditions are agreed upon, the buyer places a purchase order for specific quantities. The seller provides a pro forma invoice with the cost of goods requested along with the estimated cost for freight, insurance, carriage, and other fees that are not included in the price of goods. The buyer or a third party issues a URDTT digital trade payment facility to the seller, defining the terms and conditions of the purchase for the digital trade transaction. The seller ships the goods and compiles the transaction documents into digital documents evidencing movement, value, content, and quality. The transaction manager examines and compares the digital documents to the issue URDTT digital trade payment facility for compliance with its terms and conditions. When accepted by the buyer, the money is paid to the seller. The seller forwards by courier the hard copy originals to the buyer if they're needed for custom clearance. In case when an EUCP letter of credit is being used as payment method, a commercial bank will be the one issuing the EUCP letter of credit and examining the documents. Next slide, please. The URDTT digital trade payment facility is a digital trade transaction payment method guided by the ICC URDTT rules. The URDTT digital trade payment is issued and negotiated using UCP and EUCP documentary letter of credit guidelines. The funds supporting the instrument are available with the buyer, the obligor, or with a third party called financial service provider. The digital trade payment is issued in the universal SWIFT MT700 format using the same SWIFT field definition as it is used with a letter of credit. It is also examined in the same manner as a letter of credit, and a non-compliant discrepancies are noted to the buyer. The examination can be done by the buyer or a third party. The final payment is made to the seller in exchange for the digital documents. After the seller receives the reimbursement for the shipping documents, the hard copy original paper documents are forwarded via courier to the seller for custom clearance. As noted in the manual, the URDTT should be regarded as an overarching set of rules under which other guidelines and rules may coexist as UCP and EUCP. You'll find the link to the URDTT manual in the description of the video as well. Next slide, please. The concept for the URDTT digital trade payment transaction is simpler and straightforward. The buyer, the obligor, initiates a digital trade transaction with a purchase order, PO, supported with a principal payment obligation, PPO, to the seller, the beneficiary. The terms and conditions of the purchase order are defined by a URDTT digital trade payment facility. The payment method is a collection from buyer in exchange for the seller shipping documents to include the bill of lading, packing list, invoice, and other trade documents. The buyer may nominate a financial service provider, also known as FSP, to irrevocably undertake the principal payment obligation and make the payment on behalf of the buyer. We refer to this step as PPU, the principal payment undertaking by FSP. The financial service provider may be a financial institution or a person who undertakes the irrevocable payment obligation. And this is the beauty of the URDTT rules. The FSP can be a non-bank provider or a non-bank provider of financial services. The FSP may also be the ultimate buyer. Note that the FSP payment undertaking must be issued in accordance with all applicable laws. The digital shipping documents are used for negotiation and payment and are presented electronically in accordance with the URDTT rules, UCP, and EUCP guidelines. After payment, their hard copies may be couriered by the buyer or ultimate buyer if they're needed to clear customs, like in the case of ocean shipment. Next slide. The digital trade transaction workspace includes document templates for all the following documents required to structure, manage, and complete a digital trade transaction. You have the link to the workspace, so you have access to download for free all of the documents listed on this slide, from the basic order agreement template to the request for quotation template to quotation purchase order, all the way down to digital trade payment application and the digital trade payment document. Next slide. The workspace also includes templates for the EUCP documentary letter of credit application, the EUCP documentary letter of credit template, amendment application if needed, shipper letter of instruction, packing list, invoice. Let's move to the next slide. You'll find templates for trade bill of exchange, including the new documents under URDTT, the PPO, Principal Payment Order, and the PPU, the Financial Service Provider Principal Payment Obligation Undertaking, all the way to Notice of Completeness, Examination Report Template, Release of Funds, Release of Documents. Note that not all of the listed documents are required for a specific transaction. Which templates and trade documents are used depends on the Incoterm, the payment method, and what documents are agreed to be presented for negotiation. Next slide, please. Next, the workspace gives you access to the digital trade transaction checklist. The transaction checklist information defines the trade transaction, who the buyer and the sellers are, what the buyer wants to buy, what is the method of transportation, and how the buyer wants to pay for the products or services. You will find this checklist in the business model underneath the workspace. Next slide, please. Next, we will move into the payment method checklist, which you'll also find underneath a workspace. The trade finance terms and conditions are dependent on the payment method selected for the transaction. Fundamentally, as we discussed earlier, there are only two methods of payment, credit or collection. All payments methods are either a credit or a collection. The collection payment method used through our workspace, once again, is called eDTT, digital trade payment. And the credit payment method used through our workspace is a EUCP, documentary letter of credit. If there is a request for a letter of credit and a bank is using a letter of credit under the EUCP guidelines, under SWIFT 40E EUCP later version, this has to be mentioned in the letter of credit. The details of these two payment methods are covered in a separate webinar, so please check within the workspace for the webinar that corresponds to each of the documents that you are interested to fill out. Next slide. As mentioned, the workspace document templates are linked to training webinars, and these webinars, what we are trying to provide is a step-by-step guide to help you complete each trade document, to answer some question, and to help you understand each information and each task that is required by each document. The webinars follow the global business model manual framework that it is part of the workspace. The templates, manual, and training webinar provides a complete do-it-yourself toolkit for buyers and sellers to learn to trade online. Next slide. Adopting and implementing the DT workspace for digital international trade transaction only takes 4 steps. Bookmark the workspace into your Google Chrome or compatible browser, download and then upload documents as needed to your Google Drive, share the documents with your buyer or seller counterparty, and then start trading with everyone, everywhere. Next slide. In summary, the eDigital Trade Transaction Workspace enables trade for SMEs, buyers, and sellers, everywhere worldwide. The objective of the workspace is to increase trade by reducing transaction cost and complexity. It is intended to be used by importers, exporters, freight forwarders, and all other trade intermediaries. Next slide. Please contact my colleague, John Dunlop, or me if you have any questions or comments at the emails listed on this slide. You'll find a link to the DT workspace in the description of the video, and also a link to the eDTT manual. Thank you for taking the time to learn how new technology and ICCE rules allow us to build solutions like the digital trade transaction workspace to help small businesses structure trade and trade transactions online without commercial banks and without the fees. Thank you for joining me today, and see you soon.